Welcome back to the Donkey Vote podcast with Francis.
Tobias.
And George. These interviews will be focusing on the past careers of politicians before they entered parliament.
With a strong intention to our audience that anything is achievable no matter what you studied in university or college.
If you like this sort of content, please make sure you like, subscribe, comment, and share with your friends. Also, we are on YouTube and Spotify, so make sure you follow us on those platforms.
Make sure to follow us on Instagram as well to keep updated with the latest episodes and reels that we release.
Enjoy the
interview.
Today we are joined by the newly elected Senator for the Greens in Victoria, Steph Hodgins-May. Steph, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me on the show.
Yeah, so just for our audience out there who may not know an entire lot about you, could you give us a little brief description of yourself just before we get into the questions?
Yeah, sure. So, Steph Hodgins-May. I live on Kulin Nations land in St Kilda now with my young family. I've got two kids, and I was elected as a Green Senator for Victoria in May. So I've been in the job for a few months now, and I'm originally from regional Victoria, and really, yeah, honoured to be representing all the things that I care about in the Senate as a Green Senator.
Because I believe you were replacing Janet Rice, who retired recently as well. So those are some big shoes to fill. So hopefully you can do a great job for the Greens and represent Victoria quite well, because you are technically representing me as well, because I'm based in Victoria. So and
Oh,
probably most of
wow.
our
Great to
and probably most of our viewers as well, I'd say.
Oh, good. Well, yes, I'm. It's a big state, but I've already been getting out to as many of the sort of regional centres as I can to speak to and listen to constituents and hear about what issues are really striking a chord across Victoria. So, yes, as you said, very big hiking boots to fill in Janet Rice, but yeah, I hope that I can do the role justice. And in particular, yeah, it's great to be having a chat with young people who I think have a lot at stake at the moment with the current political fray that we're in. So look forward to listening and learning throughout this journey.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. So I think we'll get straight into our questions for you, Steph. So my first question to you is, how was your high school and university life? And do you have any memorable moments you'd like to share?
Yeah, look, my high school life was pretty nondescript. It was good. I went to school in Ballarat, and I wasn't particularly academically focused. I had a go, but I wouldn't say that I was sort of someone who was a natural leader when I was at high school. And I went off to university in Geelong actually to study international relations and law. I think, like many young people, I didn't really know what it was that I wanted to do at that age, and I'd actually never expected to get into law. And so I did really sort of strap in year 12 and studied a bit harder than I had previously, and surprised myself, I think, and my family when I was accepted into to studying international relations and law. And for me, it was sort of more of an open door degree that would leave options open for me. And I had a pretty good uni experience. I lived on residence for a while and made some really great friends through that. And then before moving to Melbourne to finish my degree at Deakin, I also studied in Sweden for 6 months, and that was a really great experience. And I think opened my eyes to the world of international relations more closely. And yeah, I came out the other end as a corporate lawyer, which I'd never expected in a million years, but it was sort of the trajectory that the unis put you on. I think corporate law is the most common sort of exit point for that. And I hadn't really thought of politics as a career necessarily back then. So I enjoyed the experience, mostly getting to meet new people, explore a few more sort of interest areas through that arts degree, but didn't last long as a corporate lawyer, which I'm sure we'll discuss.
Man, and as you were saying that, like, I think a lot of people in our audience probably have that sort of similar experience where, they're not really, very academic focused in, year seven, year eight, year nine, and, they're still trying to figure things out. And I know a lot of people, even I, who's I'm a first year uni student, I know a lot of people in the same position as me who still don't have the exact idea of what they want to do in the future. And some people might be quite stressed about that. What do you think, in terms of that sort of thing? Do you think a lot of young people should be stressed around, what they should be doing in the future, or do you think, just leave it up to, what happens in the future, and just, I guess, keep pushing forward and trying to figure out what things that work for you, and like what are your interests as well?
Yeah, look, I understand lots of people like to have a plan, and I think a loose plan's okay, but I've never been a strong planner because for me, plans typically don't go as they're meant to, and it potentially can limit you to trying new things. And I sort of reached a point where I decided just to say yes to things that, might be terrifying, whether it was speaking at a, at a conference as a guest student speaker, or whether it was going and doing work experience somewhere that I'd never thought before. I just decided, what's the worst thing that could happen? And usually I'd be terrified saying yes to these things that I didn't have experience in. I was always very scared of public speaking, still am on many occasions. But what I realized is that each time I said yes to one of those opportunities, I learned a bit. I typically made some new friends and networks, and it gave me a bit more of an idea about what I did or didn't want to do. So I don't think I've really spent too much of my life stressing. I think life's very short. I lost both parents very quickly, and I think that has been somewhat of a contributor to my attitude to life. And really, it was for me. I never saw myself as a leader until I'd said yes to a multitude of things that I didn't think I could do, but realized I could do. And then I think that from that, other people saw that they could do the same. And so now one of the most enjoyable parts of the job is working with young people and seeing them come into, election campaigns with very few election skills, really nervous, don't think that they've got the confidence to make phone calls or knock on doors, and then to go back into the office a few weeks later and see those people actually training up other young people because they've developed those skills and they've pushed themselves that bit further. And so I would say don't stress, and I would say, your career might not have a job description now. So just say yes to the things that interest you. Be willing to make a few mistakes along the way. Like I hate to think of, the lack of experience I had when I said yes to running in an unwinnable federal seat in Ballarat when I was much younger. Like I thought, but ultimately you pick up so many skills along the way, new opportunities and new doors open. So just be open to the world. It would be my advice. And there's no room for stress. There's no time for it.
Yeah, exactly. Because I think at the end of
Yeah.
the day, you cannot deny yourself those sort of opportunities, and they might only come up once in life. So you might as well be trying to say yes and trying to do as many things as possible rather than saying no and regretting your decision later on in life.
Exactly. And I think most people on the sidelines cheering you on, people don't want you to fail. So, yeah, find some good mentors as well. And don't ever be afraid to reach out to someone who inspires you and who you think might make a great mentor, and ask them if they'll do that. Ask them if they're up for a chat. Because my sense is that anyone in sort of leadership positions have had that tap on the shoulder or have had that support. So, yeah, don't be afraid to ask for things either.
Exactly. Exactly. I think now we'll move on to our second question for you, Steph. So this relates a little bit to your mother. So prior to Parliament, you set up your own foundation in honor of your mother, Vivian Hodgins, and her commitment towards education, raising over $40,000 in disaster relief in Samoa. How important are foundations and aid to smaller overseas countries? And did your mother's cause inspire you to run for Parliament?
Yeah, it's a really good question and very timely. I actually just got back from a cross-parliamentary trip to Vanuatu a couple of days ago, with that was coordinated by Save the Children and had politicians from all the political parties there. So we were really seeing how aid and development money is continuing to be spent. Yeah, in 2009, my mum was one of the people who lost their lives in the 2009 tsunami in Samoa, and I'd been to Samoa previously as part of international development sort of project that I'd taken on before starting in my legal job. And so I already was aware of some of the challenges being faced by these low-lying communities who were experiencing increased sea level rise, storm surge, whose food and water security is constantly threatened by changing climate. So I knew the challenges they were facing. I knew the grief that I was experiencing, my family were feeling, having lost our mum. But I also knew that these families, some of them had lost generations of people. One family lost 21 family members, and also their livelihoods being living on this part of the coastline of Samoa in Lalamanu. So I think that was an outlet for my family and I to sort of work with our grief, was to say, well, what can we do to help? And thankfully, the school that Mum taught at, as well as the school that I went to, we all joined together and very quickly raised about $40,000. And I headed back over to Samoa with a suitcase full of organic seeds, with agricultural equipment to really be there as soon as possible after that tsunami had happened. And that was just one form of aid that we were able to contribute, but we also contributed to the building of a library that had been destroyed in the tsunami, and then also to a program called the Organic Warriors, which was helping empower local women to really get involved with local subsistence agriculture to support their communities and to provide some sort of economic injection into those areas that had been struggling post-tsunami. So aid and development has a really critical role to play. And just in Vanuatu over the last week, I've met with villagers who have received a new water pump that's been really very helpful for their community. Met with school principals who have had contributions in the form of new school wings to replace those that were destroyed in back-to-back cyclones last year. But what I would say is that aid and development is only one part of the one of the needs that exists. And frankly, when I listen to these communities talking about the extreme weather that they're continuing to face as a consequence of climate change, we really need to be looking at the mitigating factors as well and the causes of the climate crisis. And so I did feel a bit disingenuous going into these communities and being thanked by them for Australia's aid and development contribution, but knowing that I was coming back to Australia where our government is continuing to approve new coal and gas projects, which are feeding the climate crisis and ultimately going to result in greater food and water insecurity in these regions. So it's a really important piece of the puzzle, but basically by just giving aid and development, but opening new coal and gas mines, we're pouring more fuel onto the fire, and we've got to be looking at it from both angles. And frankly, at the moment, Australia underperforms enormously in terms of the money that we put into adaptation, climate finance. It just goes nowhere near the actual damage that we're causing through our continued dependence on coal, gas, and oil. So important, but it's one part of the puzzle, and the other part is incredibly critical for us to confront.
Yeah, and exactly.
And the last part of your question, did Mum get me involved in politics? Most certainly. Look, my mum was a very staunch public school teacher. My dad was a farmer, an organic farmer. And so conservation and justice and equality came through really young in my life. But then when the tsunami happened and I realised just how little that the major parties were doing to confront the climate crisis, and really the advantages Australia had and the opportunities that we could embrace in order for us to transition and to be a more respectful and fair global player were big motivators in me getting involved with the Greens.
And it's not just in Samoa as well that's it's having a climate crisis. It's all across the Pacific, even parts of Asia as well. So it is a really, really big issue. And I think both major parties and should really be focusing on it more and pushing it forward, because it is my future, your future. It's every young person's future in society. So we've got to make sure we make the adequate and good steps towards fixing that climate issue.
Hear, hear, Francis. Well said.
All right, we'll move on to our next question for you, Steph. So, in addition to your charity work, you served as an advisor for the UN, strengthening Australia's position on the impact of the climate crisis on food security, negotiating stronger reef protections, and increasing Australia's humanitarian intake of refugees and asylum seekers. Are you able to talk a little bit about this work you undertook in the UN, and would you recommend working for the UN for any of our viewers?
Yeah, look, it was a really enlightening time in my life. I was over in New York at Australia's mission to the UN working with the AusAid team. AusAid no longer exists. It was rolled into the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. But it was also a unique time because it was a period where Australia was bidding to have a temporary seat on the UN Security Council. So basically what that meant is we needed to get the support of a certain number of UN member states in order for us to be successful with that bid. And so it also meant that we were being very good on the global stage. We wanted to pick up votes from the Pacific, so we were working very closely on reefs. This is cynic in me coming out somewhat. We wanted to win over some of the African nations, so we were really focused on food insecurity in parts of Africa. And we wanted to win over parts of Europe. And so we were really strengthening our humanitarian positions on things such as our intake of refugees and asylum seekers. And when I was over there, it was Julia Gillard was Prime Minister, Kevin Rudd was Foreign Minister, and it actually felt like we were doing some pretty good work. But I would sit opposite my colleagues from right across the world and negotiate these positions, Australia's positions on these resolutions, and I felt pretty comfortable with where our positioning was at. I finished up my term at the United Nations and returned to Australia. We won our bid for a temporary seat on the Security Council. And after we won that bid, I started to just gradually watch those commitments that I'd made being unravelled. I started to hear Bob Carr talk about, rather than talking about the humanitarian needs of refugees and asylum seekers, he started talking about economic refugees who are, moving here for economic benefit rather than from fleeing their homes for legitimate reasons. I started to watch Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard completely weaken their position on climate change and, inviting big corporations in to negotiate the mining tax. And I started to feel like a bit of a fraud. Like I'd gotten up there and spoken with these other nation state representatives and sort of guaranteed these things on Australia's behalf that were then changing to suit the domestic political atmosphere that was here. So that was a point where I sort of thought, no, the Australian government isn't the government that I want to be part of, and it's not a government that I could represent in any of those types of roles any longer. For me, integrity is a really important characteristic. They also got rid of AusAid, which I thought was a pretty cynical move. And I think there are some excellent people working for the United Nations, but also within Australia's missions. I was alongside some of those representatives in Vanuatu over the last week, and they care deeply about Australia's commitment to to supporting these nations in the face of the climate crisis and other crises. But ultimately, they're led by the Australian government. And from my point of view, the Australian government is simply not representing Australians and or global citizens in a way that is fair and compassionate and takes into consideration our humanitarian obligations and our climate obligations. So look, definitely an interesting career path, but it very much depends on the government of the day as to what our priorities are going to be globally. And I truly believe and hope that the trajectory of the Greens and independents is increasing dramatically as people and voters look outside of the major parties. And, if it was a minority government with the Greens and the Teals and maybe the Labor Party, maybe we'd see the sorts of commitments that I would feel really comfortable promoting on the global stage. And I'd be more ready to recommend that as a career path. But I think a lot of young people see the writing on the wall and see that the government's really not representing them. So we need to fix that before we, I suppose, think that we can be a great global citizen.
And interestingly as well, a lot of recent polls have come out and said that, Labour Party is on track to be a minority government. So, that situation you're talking about there with the Greens and the Teals being part of a coalition government with the Labor Party could actually happen. And we might actually start to see some of those climate goals being achieved and some more action on climate change and other social inequality issues across Australia.
That's exactly right. I think the most likely scenario after the election is a minority government. We saw in 2010 when the Greens were in minority government with the Labor, we had more Labor Party, we had more legislation passed than in any time in history, including a world-leading climate package. So I'm really optimistic about what the results will hold post-election and for our trajectory as I think a caring global citizen.
We'll see what happens. We will see what happens.
Yes. Got to keep campaigning though.
Yeah, just got to keep campaigning, I guess. And, that hard work and that fruitful work will probably pay off at the end, and, there could be an early election coming. We're not 100% sure. So we'll see what happens. But, maybe next year, Steph, you could be a minister. Or you could be.
Well, who knows? Anything's possible. And this is what I mean. You just got to keep open to the opportunity.
Exactly. So after your 2019 federal campaign, which I think we might be talking about later on, you joined Greenpeace as the head of the Pacific region. What sort of work did you undertake in this role, and how impactful is Greenpeace to the broader climate community?
Yeah, good question. Like I've always been a supporter of Greenpeace from the outside, and when I was offered the opportunity to go and work there, I jumped at it because essentially the core part of my work was working on the International Court of Justice campaign to have the International Court of Justice consider the impacts of climate change on human rights for the first time in history. So a number of nations had tried to get it through the UN General Assembly. Palau was the most recent country, but unfortunately, due to US pressure, they withdrew from their attempt to have it heard. But this was a campaign that was initiated in a classroom in Vanuatu in the Pacific Islands, where a group of law students were trying to think, what is we can't rely on some of these big global emitters to take action. So what is another course of action that we can take? And they decided on this legal action. And so for me, it was just a real honour to be led by Pacific Island activists with extraordinary skills in campaigning and diplomacy, and to be led by them and to support their efforts to really take this campaign global. Like, you can't just, it's just hard to comprehend how such a tiny island in the South Pacific can essentially spearhead a global campaign that actually won. You know, we saw for the first time in history, we had a unanimous decision of the UN General Assembly, which is made up of all the UN member states, agree unanimously to send this question to the International Court of Justice, which is now considering evidence that's been submitted by global countries, including Australia, to determine what obligations these countries owe young people in particular. And it really focuses on intergenerational justice. So one of my other exciting parts of the role was coordinating and project leading a Rainbow Warrior ship tour through the region last year. So we travelled from Australia and we took Uncle Paul and Uncle Pabai, who are two Torres Strait Islander men and activists who were suing the Australian government over climate impacts in the Torres Strait Islands. And we took them on the Rainbow Warrior over to Vanuatu, where we met with youth leaders, we met with political leaders, Ralph Regenvanu, who's the climate minister for Vanuatu, who's an extraordinary global leader on environmental and climate issues. We travelled then to Tuvalu, an island that's already got climate refugees having to be forced to move to parts of Fiji because their island is subject to sea level rise, and then to Fiji. And really, we used the vessel as a storytelling vessel and as a way to basically grow this campaign into something that would transcend the Pacific to being global. And it certainly has, and it's succeeded enormously. So I think that Greenpeace plays a really important role in the kind of ecosystem of actors that are working on environmental and climate issues. It was a privilege and honour to work there, but it was also really lovely to hand over that leadership role to a colleague who is Fiji and Indian Australian and who has those really long-standing relationships in the Pacific and who was much better placed to take that forward. So I think that for me, my theory of change has always really come back to politics. And, the engine room is the Australian government when it comes to whether or not we're approving new coal and gas mines. And for the Pacific, that's one of their, constant demands is for Australia to move away from fossil fuels. And for me, the most straightforward way of doing that was to replace current government and opposition with people who genuinely have a commitment to transitioning our economy to one that's clean, green, renewable, and really going to ensure that these beautiful Pacific Island nations can stay, these communities can stay on their country, can preserve their language and their culture, and it's just, the right thing to do. And for our kids as well here in Australia, climate change, as you said earlier, it's not contained. It doesn't respect borders, and we're experiencing significant climate impacts right across our country as well. So, really important actor. But for me, it's really that campaigning at a national level that we need to be focused on, and where my skills are probably best suited.
Because as you were saying, at the end of the day, being the Greenpeace head of Pacific is a great role, but there's not much actual change that you can actually do in that position. It's better to be in Parliament, in the government, talking to them and actually, putting legislation in place that actually will help, those sort of nations who are dealing with climate change into the future.
Well, that was how I felt like politics was a better vehicle for me, but I think that there are excellent people who are in that role now who are really pressuring from the sidelines and who are playing another important role that potentially a Greens MP can't play. So we need them all. They're all complementary, but for me personally, it felt like replacing some more government representatives with progressive ones was a good way forward.
I totally agree with you there, Steph. Totally agree with you there. So I think now we'll move on to our next question. So, who would you say is your political role model or idol?
Gosh, yeah. Oh, there are a few. But look, for me, Bob Brown is someone that I've always had an enormous amount of respect for. I think a big part of that is, despite the numerous challenges that he's faced, and yesterday he was found guilty of obstructing, forest. Like when he stood up to defend these beautiful parts of Tasmania's forests, he was arrested and found guilty yesterday. He's waiting to find out really what the sentencing is. But no matter what, he's always stood up for what he believes in, and he's done it in an incredibly respectful way. And he's maintained this optimism and hope that I think is really important. It's very easy as a climate activist or an activist in any of the areas of humanitarian or social justice to feel really overcome by grief and by the enormity of some of the challenges that we're up against. But Bob's always really stayed optimistic and hopeful and sort of seen the best in humanity. And that's something that I really aspire to. I think his courage too, as one of the first openly gay men to seek public office and to be elected, and the enormous discrimination that he faced, through to, being arrested on probably more fingers than I can count for standing up for forests, to standing up and calling out I've just had a mental blank. Former president of the USA, George Bush, when he came to visit the Australian Parliament and expected just a round of applause, Bob Brown actually got up and said, "You are not welcome here," essentially. And you can imagine the fear that would have evoked inside you. When Tampa happened and we saw all the children overboard and refugees being, thrown into the water, he got out without hesitation and said, "This is wrong. The Greens stand with refugees and asylum seekers," and condemned the government. And without thinking, is this politically popular? Is this going to increase our support? It's a matter of asking, is this the right thing to do or not? And he always falls on the right thing to do. And I think there's political courage there that's just unrivaled. So it's been a real honour sort of having his mentorship, as well as Christine Milne, who is another ferocious negotiator and defender of our forests and environment. So there's a couple that I look to.
Bob Brown, he's really the founder of the Greens movement, probably across the whole world. The Tasmanian Greens at the time was the first real Green Party in the whole entire world. So he really is a starter of a movement, and a great climate activist and someone who's been really pushing forwards climate change and protecting forests for upwards of nearly 50 years now to this point. So a really, really inspirational person there. I'm just going to say as well, I do realize you need to head off quite soon, Steph. So I think we'll move on to our final question for you. So finally, what's one piece of advice you'd give to students in 2024, especially those who are starting university or high school this year?
Yeah, look, it goes back to one of my earlier questions, is push yourself out of your comfort zone. Don't be too fixated on your results and your exams and those academic components. I think increasingly employers are looking at your extracurricular activities and how well-rounded you are as a human, and that means getting out into the world and trying new things, putting your hand up for new experiences, whether it's, learning different musical instruments, or whether it's campaigning on the front lines of a forest protest or anti-coal protest, whatever it might be. I think that the more you can do to experience the world, to understand what role you want to play in it, the better. I obviously am biased, but I think if you do have some political interest and hunger, then join a local campaign, no matter what the political persuasion you are. I obviously would recommend Greens or Independents, but put your hand up and go and turn up to a phone bank or a door knock, or offer to do some social media for a local organisation that's doing great work in your area. Just don't be too confined to thinking where you want to end up and the exact pathway that'll get you there. Because I remember some of my first interviews when coming out of uni, it wasn't like, what scores did you get? What were your results? It was like, so what do you do outside of study? And what musical instrument do you play? Or what things inspire you? And what groups have you been part of or participated in? So just be really open to those opportunities, seek them out, get politically active. Like, I would never have thought that I was going to be elected as a senator growing up in regional Victoria with, on a farm, and never having really done student politics or anything like that at uni. But really, it was a matter of just saying yes when the opportunity is presented. So don't be too hard on yourself either. Don't take life too seriously. I think this is a lesson from Bob Brown, is, we've got to enjoy our lives as well. And there's really, I think if you can find a career that you enjoy, then that's going to be a life well lived. And I've found something that I enjoy because I think it is the most impactful place that I can possibly work in. But that's going to be different for every single person. So, and good on you, Francis, for starting this podcast. Like, this is a really great thing to be doing outside of uni to expand your knowledge, but also, I suppose, provide this sort of resource for other young people who might be thinking about a career in politics, or might be, learning from those different subject matters that you're covering from week to week. So yeah, I applaud you for taking that risk and running this fabulous podcast that I'm speaking on today.
Yeah, thank you for that, Steph. We try and always set a broad sort of views. I think you've probably seen some of our previous interviews. We've talked to, some One Nation MPs, Greens MPs, Independents, Liberal, Labor, other crossbenchers. So it's really about trying to broaden everyone's perspectives and really show different sides of politics. It's not all about argy-bargy arguments and that sort of thing, and fighting in Parliament verbally. But
There's a lot of that, unfortunately.
there
But
is a lot
yes,
of that, but there is more to that than that. There's more than that in Parliament. There's more of that in politics. So it's really about bringing people together and um, really helping to educate young people about different perspectives in politics. So I do really appreciate you again coming on the podcast, Steph. And I know we have gone a little bit over time, but I do really appreciate you again coming on the podcast and speaking to us and speaking to me and to all our listeners out there. And giving your different perspective, especially on climate change and your career going forward as a Green Senator in Victoria.
oh, it was my great pleasure, Francis, and yeah, look forward to hopefully being on the show again one time in the future.
Yeah, hopefully again, Steph, I'll keep in contact with you and the rest of your office, and we'll see what comes up down the line. Maybe pre-election interview, maybe again we'll have a see. We'll have a see. All
Maybe
right,
we can
thank you again,
celebrate
Steph.
minority government together afterwards. Thank you,
Maybe
Francis.
maybe we could. Maybe we could.